Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar at the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation on understanding clinical trials in FL. I'm Nick, and I'm the research manager at the FLF. Oh, we've just seen a pre-webinar poll pop up, so please do start engaging with that. We're really excited to see everyone here today, and thank you for joining us. This webinar is part of a series, and we will be doing a different topic every other month. We already have a couple of webinars on the website, and I'll share that link with you in a minute. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded, and when we upload the video, you'll be able to only see the speakers. There's a chat box for you to put your questions in during the webinar, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please do send in your questions and introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat. Thanks to everyone that submitted questions at the registration. We'll get through them during the webinar as well and answer any others in a different format after. So we'd love to connect with you a little more today. So please do engage, participate in the polls, and enjoy the webinar. Thanks. Over to you, Mitch.
Thanks, Nick. So I want to welcome all the attendees and my panelists who we'll introduce shortly. You can see, you should see the first webinar, pre-webinar poll up there. So while we're talking, it'd be great if you can fill that out, and we'll come back to those. Some of those questions at the end, and it'll help us guide the discussion. So, yeah, I'm Dr. Mitchell Smith. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you and the fellow panelists for this webinar on understanding clinical trials in the setting of follicular lymphoma. The purpose of this presentation and discussion is really to serve as an introduction to clinical trials. We're not going to be able to cover everything. It'll be somewhat general, but we hope it'll be the entry into more knowledge for you and for future programs. Our surveys that we've had up till now have shown that there's certainly a desire and need for such information. In our polls, 70%, more than two-thirds of you requested details about trials for follicular lymphoma, and 42% wanted broader information about clinical trials. So we'll divide the webinar into several sections, little bite-sized pieces, each presenting some initial information, and then followed by a discussion with our panelists to get their input. As I said, please participate in the polls. This information is very important for us, helps guide the discussion, and helps guide our future programs. Please use the chat to ask any questions, and we'll monitor them. We'll try to collate them and answer the ones we can by the end. As a disclaimer, the information and discussions today are for informational purposes only, do not constitute medical advice. Please consult with your own healthcare team for your specific medical advice. I'm sure there's a wide range of knowledge among the participants in the audience today. We'll try to make this accessible to as many as we can, but we do assume that you're on the FLF site, that you have some knowledge of FL, follicular lymphoma. We do have some basic knowledge sessions you can visit at your leisure on our Your Support Hub on our website, as well as an overview of FL, a previous webinar, which deals a lot with diagnosis, staging, and initial treatment. Note also that we are global here, and some of the things we say may be specific to a country, so that things may be a little bit different wherever you are. So with that as beginning, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Professor Jessica Okosin, who can tell us why she's here and what she's and get us started.
Thanks very much, Mitch. Hello, everyone. So I'm Jessica Okosin, and I'm a professor at Barts Cancer Institute in London. So I'm a practicing hematologist with a special interest in lymphoma. And I also have a research lab working on new treatments and therapies and biology of lymphoma. So I've served as the scientific advisor to the FLF from its inception. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you. Nikki, you want to go next? You're muted, I think.
Sorry about that. I'm not used to the mute button. Thanks, Mitch. Yeah, thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I am Nikki Greenhalgh, the founder and co-admin of Living with Follicular Lymphoma. I'm here on this panel today as a patient because I was a part of a clinical trial for my first line of treatment. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this webinar and speaking more in depth about clinical trials.
And on to you, Simon, and you're also, there you go.
Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm a follicular lymphoma patient. I was first diagnosed actually with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma back in 1999, so I've lived with the disease for a long time. And I also took part in a clinical trial, but it wasn't for lymphoma. It was in relation to my heart. So I've taken part in a clinical trial, and I guess I'm here to just give a broader outlook on clinical trials and to help in any way that I can.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think I should say I'm in Washington, D.C., so we are scattered around the globe, and that's why the timing for some of you may be a little bit odd, but hopefully everyone will stay awake for this. So I don't know, can we see the poll on have you participated in a clinical trial? So the poll that you should have had is, have you participated in a clinical trial? Yes. An FL specific? Yes. A non-follicular lymphoma clinical trial? As Simon mentioned, no, I haven't, or I'm in the process of deciding. And then the second question was, how well informed do you feel about understanding clinical trials? I can see the results, perhaps. I don't see them. While we're waiting for those to come up, there we go. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm getting a little note here. Okay. So it's interesting that 91% of people have not been in a clinical trial, 9% yes. And so I think this is sort of an interesting statistic, because we know that a relatively small number of people actually enter clinical trials, and there's a whole host of reasons for this, and we will be discussing some of these. And 3% of people said they were in the process of deciding whether to join a clinical trial. So that would be hopefully some benefit for today's. And when we talk about are you informed, it was a pretty good split among people, but I would say most people felt not terribly informed. None of you voted 5, and it was generally split between 1, 2, 3, 4. So there is a broad range of knowledge in what you're feeling and what you're looking for out of today's program. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what are clinical trials and why they're important. And I think one of the keys is the fact that less than 10% of you have been on a clinical trial. So clinical trials are carefully designed and carefully conducted according to a plan, which is called the protocol. This is a scientific way to determine whether a new treatment is safe and effective. And Dr. Okosa and Jessica will help us understand the different kinds of trials in a shortly. In follicular lymphoma, almost all treatments are systemic. That means they're either pills or intravenous or now subcutaneous. So we don't talk a lot about clinical trials of radiation and surgery for follicular lymphoma, so I'm not going to spend time on those. So they can start from testing a new drug that's never been in a patient, all the way up to advanced stage trials where we're comparing, for instance, 2 drugs that are standard plus a third that might be new. So there's a wide range of testing. And it's basically trying to find out, is it safe, effective, and then is it better than what we have already? Is it a better, either more effective or less side effects, or both? And it really is, these are the way we move the field forward, and they're critical to making advances. So we really do need to increase our ability to get patients onto trials. So your doctor often will be the one to suggest a clinical trial for your situation. There are ways to search on the internet, various websites. They're not always ideal, but because you're so specific about what your disease, what treatment you've had, that can affect whether you're eligible for a trial. It's important to remember that it is your decision, so the doctor can discuss this with you, but ultimately it's your decision. And as it feel that it's the best thing for you to be on that. This requires you to have full information about the trial, and that's usually in the what's called informed consent document. This is an important document. It's a lot of time spent in writing these so that they are legible, readable at a reasonable level, and tell you what the drug is, why they're testing it, what it's going to mean for your day-to-day, how many visits, et cetera, and your investment, and what the potential risks and benefits are. And these all have to be weighed. Ultimately, it's a weighing of risks and benefits. No treatment comes without some risks, even standard treatments. But there are clear rules for making sure this is done safely, and monitoring continues closely while you're on the trial. I also want to mention that nowadays, especially with all the molecular studies we have, in addition to clinical trial, the actual treatment, there are molecular studies. So laboratory correlates would help us tell you how and why people did or didn't respond, and that can help us move forward. And often that's done on either a blood test or your initial biopsy. In terms of who enters trials, obviously, if you think it's best for you, if your doctor thinks this is the best treatment, it's a way to get cutting-edge treatments. You'll get careful follow-up on the trial because it's mandated in the protocol. And ultimately, it's the only way we're going to make advances and have new drugs approved. And we've had lots of new drugs approved in the last 5 years. And that's all because people have been on clinical trials. So really important that we get the trials out there, but also that we do it safely and make sure that it's good for you. So Jessica, maybe I'll turn to you to tell us a little bit about different types of trials and as they relate to follicular lymphoma.
Thanks very much, Mitch. Yeah, no, exactly as you say. I mean, ultimately, it's important that all drugs are fully researched and evaluated before they can be used for everyone. And really, trials are really looking to answer those questions. Does a new treatment work? You know, how does it compare to existing treatment? Are there specific side effects we need to think about? Can it improve the patient's, our follicular lymphoma patient's quality of life? So all of those trials are trying to answer some of those questions. So if we think about trials relevant to follicular lymphoma, we've got to start off with rituximab. So that's been around for 25 years. And actually, the approval of that came from clinical trials, not just in follicular lymphoma patients, but actually in patients with many different types of lymphomas. And that was 25 years ago. If we think about the treatments that we have currently for follicular lymphoma patients, the majority of those have come about through clinical trials previously. So for example, we had a trial asking the question, what is the ideal chemotherapy backbone? It's a question that we as physicians struggle with. There are lots of different chemotherapy agents, but which one is better? And there have been trials that have asked that question. And I think this was a large Italian phase 3 trial. So what that means essentially that this is a randomized trial, that it's asking a specific question. It's taking a standard approach and comparing it to what's called an experimental approach. And that experimental approach might be a new therapy or thinking about using an existing therapy in a different sort of way. So we have had trials asking that question, what is the ideal chemotherapy backbone? We've had trials ask whether there are antibody therapy. So rituximab is a monoclonal antibody, which has been in existence for 25 years, but then there have been newer antibody therapies like obinutuzumab, and we had a large phase 3 trial called Gallium, which asked the question, if we combined rituximab with chemotherapy, is the new combination of obinutuzumab, which is a new monoclonal antibody, is that better than the old monoclonal antibody? So it's really important to have these trials, because these trials led the way in terms of the approval of these therapies. We don't stop there. So trials are there to obviously ask questions, but as we answer the questions, we think about how can we continue to move the field forward. So for example, we've always thought about using treatment, chemotherapy and monoclonal antibodies, but we're also now thinking about, can there be better antibodies? So we're starting to see clinical trials using bispecifics in patients. We're starting to think about, do we need chemotherapy at all? So we are having trials where we're looking at what they call chemo-free options. So I think that this is really the trials of follicular lymphoma are important for every aspect of a patient's journey, whether it's treatment in the front line, whether it's treatment in the relapse setting where there is no standard. And that can sometimes be a bit challenging because we don't know real consensus of how patients with relapse lymphoma, when their follicular lymphoma comes back, what we should be treating them with. I'm sure many of us have heard about new immunotherapies like bispecifics and CAR T-cell therapies. And we've had some really exciting clinical trials over the last couple of years that has led to the approval of CAR T-cell therapy and led to the approval of bispecific therapies, particularly for follicular lymphoma patients where their lymphoma has come back. So I think trials are incredibly important because they ask us, they ask an important question, and they allow us to improve the treatments that we currently have.
Great. Can you, I know we're going to get to some of this later, but there's a question in the chat already asking about, it really gets out to, first in human versus phase 2 versus phase 3, or a drug, where the first 10 patients might be looking at the dose and then expanding. Just spend like a minute or two going over that for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, some of us may have heard about the different phases of clinical trials. We have phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, much of when we have a new drug that hasn't been tested or has only been tested preclinically, in other words, that has not been tested, has mostly been tested in, either animal models, for example, it's important before those therapies are brought into these what they call first in human studies. They are tested in phase 1 trials. And these are early phase clinical trials really to test new therapies in very small numbers of patients. One, to determine what's the appropriate dose. So they have what they call dose escalating or dose finding trials to work out what's the most appropriate dose for patients, but also to evaluate the safety. Are there side effects that we were not aware about preclinically? And these sort of smaller early phase 1 studies allow us to answer the question about what's the appropriate dose in patients, and secondly, what are the side effects that we need to think about with these particular therapies? So those are phase 1 or early phase studies. When we start looking at phase 2 studies, these are in these settings, these are trials where we already have an idea what the dose should be, and we have an idea of what the safety or toxicity of the drugs are. And it allows us to ask the question by expanding the number of patients in these trials to more evaluate or to ask the question, how effective are these drugs? So we know that they're safe, we know what the doses are, but are they truly effective? So those are early phase studies, phase 1 and phase 2. When we come on to the larger phase 3 studies, these are typically what we call randomized studies. We are typically asking a question, comparing it to a standard approach, so comparing it to existing treatments. Can a new treatment or combination of a new treatment work better than our existing therapies? And it's important in these trials that it's randomized so that it doesn't essentially, that the effect doesn't happen by chance. These are usually larger, multi-center, multi-country sometimes studies, and they allow us to answer the question about how is the new therapy, is it better, worse, or the same as existing therapies?
Great, thanks. So, Nikki, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with trials and, how this fits with what we've been discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was diagnosed in 2014 with grade 2, stage 4 follicular lymphoma. I believe I was in the right place at the right time, to be honest. I was... The doctor said straight away, I thought I was going to have chemotherapy, but he said, oh, there's a trial that they're doing. It's almost coming to an end. I was actually one of the last patients from the trial. The trial ended up having 31 participants. And this one was not chemotherapy. It was a combination of rituximab, so immunotherapy with radioactive iodine, so essentially radioimmunotherapy. Now, I believe it was a phase 2 clinical trial, and I don't think they continued afterwards, which I'm not sure why, but for myself, they told me at the time they were having about an 80% response rate, and I thought, well, they're good numbers, and I haven't had a relapse since, so I feel very, very lucky to have had the opportunity to been on that trial, and but being a person very green at the very beginning, I guess I was sort of in a situation where I was offered this, trial, and to be grateful, and I was given like a whole pile of paperwork. Oh, pardon me. I was given a very large pile of paperwork, which I did not understand at all. Like, I read it, but I didn't get it. So I think if you're going to go on a clinical trial, it's really important to have someone there to help explain everything to you. I went with the flow, but I did feel very supported by the whole team. I was having weekly blood tests. I was being followed up. I felt very supported, and just very grateful to be a part of that trial.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think you touched on a couple of points, is especially if you're newly diagnosed, you're sort of overwhelmed, and you don't know what questions to ask. And then again, I think the fact that you were on a cutting edge therapy that has done well for you shows you that even when it's initial therapy, some people think clinical trials are, like the last stage, the last resort. Absolutely not. I think we're moving them closer and closer. A lot of trials in frontline because we have so many exciting drugs. So what would you, I think we might have time built in for this later, but I'm just curious, what would your advice for someone, being told about a trial now, what in terms of understanding, and would you approach it differently, asking different questions?
Yeah, look, it's hard to say because my mindset at the time is very different to my mindset now. So now I know a lot more. I've since been studying, and I know a lot more about the health science. So I think at the time I wasn't thinking about it. My mind was just distraught over my diagnosis. I was actually grateful at the time that I was able to do something about it, and I wasn't being put on watch and wait, which now I know what I know. I wish I did have the opportunity to go on watch and wait, so I had that time to think about it and to learn more. But I was I was diagnosed in February. I held them off as long as I could because I was still breastfeeding my son, and I wanted to keep doing that as long as I could. So they said the latest I could wait was no more than another month. So I had to start that in May. So yeah, it was all very quick for me. And I really wish someone had sat me down and clearly explained it to me, because when I had the meetings with the researchers and hematologists, it was I felt like I didn't know what to ask. So they, I was given the opportunity to ask questions, but I didn't really know what questions I needed to ask. There wasn't much information out there at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a key point. So our next topic follows on that, which is what is it about taking part in clinical trials? Am I going to be a guinea pig? Is this sort of end stage, whatever? We've had some polls, and not surprisingly, what patients want to know is, if I'm in a trial, is it safe? What are the expected side effects? How is it going to work? How effective is it going to be? And what does it mean for my day-to-day life? What are the logistics? So, and as Jessica mentioned, there's lots of different levels of trials, but the key is that informed consent document. And Nikki, sometimes it's presented in a way like, here, sign this, but I think it's important that patients really spend time reading it, hopefully, as you point out, with someone with you who can help you, just center you and be as a little bit unemotional about it. And you should ask the doctor questions. The research staff should be able to answer your questions about all of these issues. So it comes up, and Nikki, you mentioned, gee, you're breastfeeding, you got this, you got logistics, I got all these things. So there's a lot of barriers to getting patients on clinical trial, and many of them are, what's going on in your life. But Jessica, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about barriers to clinical trials, and particularly issues of safety that they might have concerns. I know those are two separate topics, but I'll throw them both at you.
Great, thanks, Mitch. Yeah, absolutely. I think, I can't remember what the statistics is, but it's essentially something like 5 to 10% of patients go on cancer clinical trials. And there are barriers from all aspects. I mean, there are barriers from a patient perspective, from a physician perspective. But actually, when I've sort of talked to patients about this, is really barriers to participation is actually a lot of patients just are not aware of the clinical trials that are available. Is it available in their hospital? Is it available in their region? And they don't know how to access these trials. So I think that sometimes is being able to have that information, knowing where to look for that information. I think that there is a lot of information on the internet, but it's very widely dispersed. People don't know how to, they're not centered in terms of where to look for that information. So I think certainly lack of awareness is one problem in terms of barriers to participation. There's obviously a lot of people, as you say, to think about trials as am I a guinea pig? And, and their concerns about, a lot of patient concerns about risks. And I think this is actually perhaps one of the main barriers to participation because people don't know what to expect. So I think to try and alleviate a lot of that, I think it's really important to have, I think, a number of conversations. So sometimes patients sometimes feel, as you say, that the form is shoved in front of them. They feel they've got to sign it. And actually, we have what we call sort of trial consults with patients. So if we're going to talk about a clinical trial, we'll discuss, I give them all the options. Well, this is what the standard option is. These are what the trials that are available. And these are the questions that trials are trying to address. And I kind of give them some insight into why that trial, why that question is important and whether I think it'll be a good fit for them. And then we typically go through that. We spend 45 minutes, an hour talking through this, and I actually give the information to them. And as Nikki and probably Simon would know, a lot of this information are reams of, there's a lot of information there. So actually what I do is I say, okay, I want you to focus on page 20. This is a bit that this explains, this explains what the clinical trial is. I want you to focus on side effects because that's really important to you as a patient. I want you to focus on logistics, how often you're going to have scans, how often you're going to have blood tests, because that side is incredibly important. Logistics, how often you have to come to the hospital. Are you getting more scans than you would normally do if you were not on a clinical trial? So I think that at spending the time to discuss, what a clinical trial entails from beginning to end, I think is really important. And I think that once people know how much time might be involved, like why is it different, then they can decide for themselves whether it's something they're willing to participate in. Another thing that is really quite important is that every clinical trial has what's called eligibility criteria. And this is really sort of a set of requirements that a patient must meet to allow them to join the trial. And this can be, it could be the age of the patient, the type of lymphoma, their health, or their treatment history. And I think that the criteria is really important because it helps us to reduce the medical differences amongst the patients in the trial. And so sometimes it may be that patients are not eligible because they don't fit one of these sets of requirements. So I think it's really important for patients to understand that as well, because sometimes what happens is I have patients that come in and say, Professor Kosin, these are the trials. Which ones do you think I should go on? And then we then go through, are they eligible? Does it fit for their disease journey? Does it fit for them? So I think that's really quite important. So there are a number of barriers, but I think there are ways to overcome it. The more we understand what these barriers are, particularly from the patient perspective, then we try to improve upon that. So if we come on to safety, because people, patients, one of the things they worry about is, am I a guinea pig? Are these clinical trials, how are they regulated? And actually, they are very highly regulated. I think that's the message I want to put across to patients or the audience in the panel. There are a number of checks and processes that are required for a clinical trial to happen. So one, we need to make sure it's safe and it's appropriate before patients can enroll. And so to do that, we have so many checks and balances that have to go through. The trial in its inception has to go through an ethics committee. So this is an independent committee. I think maybe in the US it's called the Institutional Review Boards, I think, Mitch. These are independent committees that basically review the protocol. They check that the trial is well designed, legal, and ethically, and does not involve any unneeded risks for the patient. So I think that's really important. So that's making sure that ethically it's appropriate. And then in different countries, you have different regulatory approval. In the UK, we have something called the MHRA, which is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. They always have very long names, so we need acronyms to remember them. So MHRA. And you need the ethics and you need these sort of independent regulatory body. In every country, there is one of these government organizations that helps to regulate the use of therapies in the countries. So and so that's even before the trial started, right? So this is just trying to get the trial approved. Once the trial is running, in every trial, there is what is called a trials management group. So these are basically a group of individuals that are responsible for the day-to-day running or management of the trial. And they'll typically involve trial managers, the clinical investigators, data managers. And really, the role of this trial management group is to really monitor all aspects of the trial. Is it conducted well? Are there any concerns regarding safety and toxicity? If, for example, there are new toxicity or side effects that the investigators weren't aware about, this data is collected and it's discussed to see whether the trial is still safe. And I think it's really important because this really is, this committee is important because it needs to really safeguard the participants, to really safeguard the patients on the trial. So there are a number of regulatory bodies before the trial starts, but also as the trial is ongoing to make sure things are remain safe for the patients on the trial.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Simon, let's bring you in here and tell us a little bit about your experience and how what you can tell our audience. You're still on mute. Simon, you're on mute.
I'm not now. How's that?
There you go. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay. Technology. I'm supposed to understand this stuff. Anyway, sorry. Yes, I was originally diagnosed back in 1999, originally with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, stage 4, and it had already spread to my spine. So I also had, in addition to CHOP chemotherapy, it wasn't combined with rituximab in those days. It's 25 years ago, and as Jessica said earlier, rituximab was still in the very early stages then. So I just had straightforward CHOP chemotherapy, which was pretty tough at the time. But I also had intrathecal methotrexate, which is injected into the spinal cavity. So yeah, so following on from that, it was very successful, and I remained in remission until 2017, so some 18 years later almost. And then I got a bit of a shock because I got the symptoms of a relapse and found that my lymphoma had come back as follicular lymphoma, and I was treated with bendamustine and rituximab, that was also successful in putting me back into remission, where I've remained ever since. However, as a part of the follow-up to the bendamustine and rituximab treatment, I underwent a routine echocardiogram to check my heart, and they found that my ejection fraction was very low. It was something like 29%. I think a healthy person is somewhere in the low 50%, and my left ventricle had been damaged. The general consensus was that it was probably caused by the CHOP chemotherapy all those years ago, and it had only just shown itself. So that's what happened to me, and I then in November 2022. I was looking at what my options were, because I'd been told that my life expectancy with this heart failure wasn't particularly good. So I was looking at my options, searching on the internet to see what I could find as to what I could do. And I discovered a clinical trial in London, which was stem cell treatment, to have my own stem cells taken from bone marrow in my hip and then fed through an artery in my wrist up to my heart, and that was then enabled the professor to drop these stem cells onto my left ventricle, which had the intention of regrowing that muscle, and I think it was partially successful. My breathlessness improved quite considerably, and I'm still around to tell the tale, so I guess it was successful in that respect. And the information that I had was very good. I also went through some of the testing that Jessica mentioned earlier, which was important to me. And I wanted to know what the risks were, but I didn't have a lot of options at the time. I think it was either that or a heart transplant, which I wasn't quite ready for. So yeah, I think the clinical trial was really good for me. It helped me to improve my quality of life, and I felt that the process was very straightforward, very well managed by the staff. And I got a lot of information, as Nikki said earlier, reams of information, which was also very helpful. Not all of which I understood, but I was keen to get on this trial, and I was very, very pleased when, having undergone the tests for eligibility, to be accepted, and then it seemed to work pretty well. And I've had follow-up. Already had several follow-up appointments. I've got another one coming up. I think my next one is actually in January next year. So I've been well monitored, and I'm very pleased with the results.
Okay, so that sounds like you're an example of how it's supposed to work. You get the information, you make a decision, but again, it's balancing risks and benefits. If your alternative had been untested stem cell therapy or some standard therapy that's pretty easy, the decision might have, the risk benefit.
Yeah, I guess, Mitch, I think one of the things that was, I think, really I was most pleased with was that this was not stem cells from a donor. I was a little bit more apprehensive about accepting stem cells from a donor than my own stem cells taken from the bone marrow in my hip. And when I learned that certainly put me at ease and answered my questions.
Yeah. So I think, a lot of what you're saying is it emphasizes what we're sort of focusing on is have the information, consider it, and really then make the decision that's best for you, what the trial or what is standard therapy. If standard therapy is a heart transplant, that makes the balance a little bit different. So again, that'll be different for everybody in terms of their own disease and how it's happening. So thank you for that. So we wanted to switch gears a little bit now to talk about, we focused on discussing and getting the information from your healthcare team, your healthcare provider. So we're going to ask you how confident you feel in discussing clinical trial options with your healthcare provider. So that poll will be up there. While it's going, I did want to say, I think we did have a section on here where we're going to have Jessica talk about what you should ask your doctor after this, but I think she covered that quite nicely, actually, in her previous discussion. So once the poll's over, I'll just ask her if there's anything else to add. But I think we've gone into that as to you should ask them anything you're uncertain about so that you're comfortable getting into the trial. I'm waiting to see the poll come up. And then there are a couple of questions I'm just going to deal with briefly while we're waiting. So someone asked, what's the Helsinki protocol for clinical trials? The Helsinki Declaration was actually one of the things that talk about medical ethics and all the things that we've been talking about the care that goes into clinical trials, the ethics of it, the informed consent. They really outline all of the medical ethics approaches so that we make sure that research is conducted in a safe manner that teaches us what's going to and that advances the field. There were some old examples of things that were not done properly that we now make sure that these are all done for with the monitoring that Jessica had mentioned. So in discussing clinical options, it's actually encouraging that almost half the people are rated 4 or 5. So that's good. And about a little over a third of the people rated at 3. So I think that's a good sign these days, because I think there were days when doctors would say, just do what I tell you. And those days are over. And you should feel very comfortable discussing with your doctor your options, which always include clinical trials. And as I mentioned early on, are really the way to advance the field. So I'm actually pleased to hear that, to see that poll result, that you're not sitting there afraid to talk to your doctors about that. So I'm gonna then turn to Nikki, to talk about anything else that, from your experience and people who, given what you talked about, what you would advise people. You did mention a little bit about this earlier, but just focus on, someone looking at a clinical trial today. What advice would you have for them?
Look, I think for myself, I was basically handed this trial on a platter, and like I said before, I feel very lucky about that. But what I think is really powerful as a patient is, like what Simon said, he went searching for his options and he found this clinical trial. And I just think that is incredibly powerful on our end as patients, that we, there's so much that we can do. And a lot of people don't realize that. It gives us so much hope. So, yeah, look for your options, hunt them down, ask, get a second opinion, a third opinion, just to make sure that you're getting the best possible options to choose from. And then, like Mitch said, weigh up the benefits with the risks, and talk to someone. If you're not sure about something, find somebody, even within the research team. They're so helpful. From my experience, they're very helpful. So they will take the time to spend with you, or even put you in touch with a psychologist or another professional that can help you, talk you through it, and weigh up those benefits and those risks. Also considering quality of life, not just side effects of the treatment. What's your quality of life going to be like afterwards? So I think they're really important questions, and to make those final decisions.
Yeah. I think one of the things we're fortunate with follicular lymphoma is, for most people, there is some time to think about and make that decision. Other diseases,
Absolutely.
sometimes, unfortunately, you don't have time. You're either, hey, this is it, you got to do this right now. So often in FL, we do have time, which allows you to do that searching. And maybe I'll ask, Steph and Nikki, but Simon, I mean, it sounds like this did meet your expectations, the clinical trial, and the benefit risk analysis was sort of pretty clear. Stem cell on a protocol or a heart transplant. Nikki maybe didn't understand her options.
But it definitely met my expectations, I tell you. It was 10 years ago, and the hematologist that I had originally told me my prognosis was 10 years with treatment. So I haven't had any other treatment since that clinical trial, and I haven't needed it. So it exceeded my expectations, let's say that.
Great.
Yeah, I think it did mine as well, Mitch, because I think, I was told that the majority of patients with my type of heart failure don't last more than 5 years, and 7 years, 8 years later, I'm still here and still living my life. So I'm
looking quite fit, actually.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I don't think I'd take anyone on over 100 meters, but I'm playing the occasional game of golf, so I can't really complain.
So if I could rephrase it, I think it's be proactive, take your it's your health, and the doctors can be helpful, but you really do have to take charge and sort of make those decisions. So I want to come back now to the polls, actually, and see, again, we're going to ask you how well informed you are about understanding clinical trials and how confident you are about asking them. So hopefully that will give you a minute to do that and see what the numbers show at this point. Jessica, anything we didn't cover that you think is important for patients to be aware of?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot. I think it's perhaps where to look for information, like Simon went hunting for it, and sometimes the difficulty is that in the treating center of a patient, those trials may not be available, and so they may not be offered it because it's not available there. It doesn't mean there aren't trials for the patient. So it's sort of knowing for each in your individual countries where to look for that information. So, you know, in the UK, we've got a number of great charities. Lymphoma Action has got like a great trials link. Lymphoma Coalition has, I think it's got a database of clinical trials for most countries. So it's sort of just knowing where to look for that information, and actually bringing that information to your treating physician, because they may sometimes not be aware of the trials that are ongoing. So I think as many have said already, that sometimes a level of being proactive is I think also really quite important as well.
I think that's a question that's come up in the chat as well. Is there's so many trials. How does a patient get to it, but also how does a physician stay up abreast of all of these things? And there's two times. There's people like you who work and live in the lymphoma field and know everything about it, and then there's, you know, physicians out in the community who treat all sorts of different cancers and may not be as well up on things. So can you maybe mention what, you know, how doctors stay up on things, and then we'll cover separately how patients can find things.
Yeah, no, I agree, Mitch. I mean, even that sometimes is in the field, it's mind-boggling the number of trials. I think I had a look at the number of follicular lymphoma trials in you know, the clinicaltrials.gov, and there are hundreds of them across the world. It is difficult to keep abreast of it, but I think that for a community physician, I think that one of the things that we try to do in many countries is that for these physicians to keep up to date, attending conferences, attending webinars like this, educational events, so that they are aware of what's ongoing. So I'll give an example. In the UK, for example, we have an annual lymphoma trials day where physicians, lymphoma physicians or hematologists from all around the country come down to London. And it's a showcase showing the range of clinical trials that are available in the different lymphomas. Because sometimes people, physicians in smaller community centers may not be aware of that. So there are a number of these sort of, let's say, showcase events where the trials that are available are discussed with practicing hematologists. And then also for someone like myself, I mean, equally, it's also the challenge is that every center, even in an academic center, we do not have the resources to have every trial open for every patient type. So we are also quite selective about the trials that we are able to open in our center. So and we try to have a set of criteria that allows us to choose which of those trials we should have in our center, either because, for example, if we see a lot of follicular lymphoma patients, then I think it's important that we have enough follicular lymphoma trials because we see a lot of follicular lymphoma patients. So there is some thoughts, even in academic centers, how we choose the trials that we have at our centers. And I think it's really, just as patients have to be proactive, as physicians and hematologists, we have to be proactive as well. We have to go out there and understand, what is available and what is in the best interest of our patients. Because I know that the great thing about listening to Nikki and Simon is we've heard success stories, but we've also got to be cognizant of the fact that also for some patients, trials may not be successful. So we need to try and balance that as well, because there are some trials that ask a specific question, and unfortunately that question is that either the therapy isn't as effective. And so we need to take that into account as physicians and hematologists as well when deciding on trials.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think sometimes physicians in the community may not know all of these things, and that's why you can bring them, hey, here's some trials for follicular lymphoma. Do you think, can you tell me which ones I might be eligible for based on my prior treatment stage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a question about, is there one location to locate clinical trials? And the unfortunate answer is no, as Jessica just mentioned. There is, for instance, a website, clinicaltrials.gov, but it's very unwieldy. You can hone it down by site and geography. There was another question about trials in different countries. So sometimes it comes down to logistics. If you live in the UK within reasonable traveling distance of London, your options are much higher than if they're out in the other parts. And the same, and if there's a trial available in Washington, D.C., where I am, and you can't travel from the UK over and stay for 2 months or however long it is, those trials just aren't reasonable for you. So a lot of it has to do with logistics. So generally, you'd be looking for trials, hopefully in your local center or nearby expert center. But it is a lack, and we have some. It is an area that we probably need to improve on as a community as to how patients can get information on clinical trials in a more manageable way. So someone also asked whether patients can get information on how the trial proceeded and what the overall results were. So I'm wondering, Nikki, did you ever get follow-up on that trial? And did anyone ever come and say, of the 30 patients, this is what happened? Or
Well, I've got the paper on it. The paper was published, I think, only a few months after I finished, because I was one of the last patients. And it was, I mean, I've gone back to it over the years, and I understand it a lot more now. But it was very interesting to see, what side effects the different participants had. I know when I was having the treatment, I got thrombocytopenia, so my platelets dropped dramatically. And when I look at the paper, there was one person that got that. So I'm like, that's me. So I thought that was pretty cool. I'll actually share my paper on the Living with Follicular Lymphoma group after this, so if anybody's interested in having a look. But since then, we've had no follow-up, and I'd be really interested to know how the other patients are doing, and I'm very tempted to contact the head researcher on their trial just to ask him. But yeah, there's been no other follow-ups, and I don't know of anyone else having the treatment. So even though it was successful for me, it's
But it is out there. The results should be published. There are now rules that if you had a trial and it was registered, that it has to be presented and the data have to be available. So it's a question of how long it takes to get that out there. I will say, as Jessica mentioned earlier, there's ongoing monitoring during it. And if there's anything that comes up that would change whether you would want to be on that trial, that information is communicated to the doctor and the patient in real time. So I know we're running close to time here, but the post-webinar poll, I'm actually quite excited about, because in terms of how you feel about knowledge of clinical trials, we now have 50% feeling that they're a 4 or a 5. So well, and for 92%, only 8% are still in the 0, 1, or 2 range. So I feel like we have made some progress. And similarly, patients are more, the people on the call are more comfortable than they were at the beginning discussing clinical trial options. So I think those are, that we've made some headway here. But again, it's just a scratch on the surface. I think we have, let's take a couple more minutes for some questions. So Jessica, are there any specific pharmaceutical companies specializing in follicular lymphoma drug development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think many of the pharmaceutical companies are making drugs across the breadth of diseases. I mean, not just follicular lymphoma, but across lymphomas, and it could be across blood cancers as well. There are obviously some companies pharma companies that we're more familiar with because they've made many more drugs for the lymphoma patients. So, for example, Roche, which made a lot of the monoclonal antibodies, rituximab, obinutuzumab, and also some of the new bispecifics. So there is not one specific pharma company that is, dedicated to making therapies for follicular lymphoma, and perhaps they shouldn't be, I think, because actually it might really stifle the therapies that we have, because each of these pharmaceutical companies have different types of expertise, and there are sometimes small pharma companies that make small molecule inhibitors, and Roche, for example, obviously they're the world leaders in immunotherapy. So there isn't one, and perhaps there shouldn't be one. I think that it increases the diversity of therapies we have available.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think it's important also to say that, follicular lymphoma is a B-cell lymphoma, and some of these drugs, like rituximab and some of the newer CAR T, et cetera, are targeted to B cells. And so they might be trials for a whole range of B-cell lymphomas, follicular lymphoma one part of them. So there's FL-specific trials, there's also B-cell lymphoma-specific trials, and some companies will do say aggressive lymphoma, and then once it's approved there, they'll say, now we'll try it in follicular. So there's various pathways. There's a number of questions we had before and here that are more specific to actual treatments and side effects and whatever. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to cover those. I would refer you to our previous webinar where we did, Dr. Kosin and Dr. Brian Hill talked about staging and initial treatment. And for instance, there's a question there about lenalidomide rituximab, and we did talk about that. There was an earlier question, CHOP versus bendamustine rituximab. So some of those things we did discuss in that other webinar, so I would refer you to that one. So, you know, we could go on for a while. I would love to answer many of your questions, and some of them are very, they're all interesting. In the last minute before I wrap up, I did want to talk about one about geography. So can you join a trial outside of the country that you're in? Because we do have a global audience today. I think Nikki and Simon, you were both fairly local trials. Not everyone can travel. Would you have been able to travel for?
Well, I guess we're lucky that we live in a small country, but yeah, I was fortunate in that we'd only recently moved from the north of England to the south. Anybody who is a native of the UK will recognise that I have a rather northern accent, and I'm only 80 miles from London, which takes just over an hour on the train, so it's not really a problem for me. And I think even had I been still up in the northwest, it's still only a 4-hour trip. And my trial didn't involve too many visits. I was fortunate that I went through the tests initially, and I think I only had another couple of appointments before I actually had the treatment itself.
Yeah, so I think that's a key, is that you know, the logistics really determine that. There's no, you know, you're allowed to travel even to another country, but then you get into insurance questions, who's paying for it, and so there are some logistics when you travel across into different countries that need to be addressed, but it is possible. All right, so we really now are down to actually we have to end. So I want to thank our panelists for their excellent input, the audience for its attention. I think we can put a slide up that thanks our supporters. We really did get support from these companies who are very interested in developing clinical trials and in follicular lymphoma. And as we mentioned, it's important that we get patients on trials to advance the field. This is the first of our new series of webinars, so keep an eye out for our next webinar, which should be in September. Go back to that earlier one for some really important basic information. Please let us know if you'd like another webinar on clinical trials and how that would be best structured to meet your needs, any specific aspects you want us to cover. We definitely take that into account. We'd love to hear any of your feedback. There'll be a survey that pops up when we're done. We really appreciate your input into it because we do listen to it. Everything we do is about the patients. It's for you, and we want to do what's provide you with what you want. The information up there is the website, and look out for us on social channels as well as the website. And please, we do have a patient story section of our website, and please get in touch if you're interested in sharing your story on our website. So with that, we've managed to end right on time, and I apologize for anyone whose questions I wasn't able to get to, but I think some of them will be answered in the earlier webinars, and we're happy to take them forward to our new webinars. So with that, thank you again to our panelists and all our participants, and we hope that you found this useful, and please provide your feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.